Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, or you like yeah, thank you for.
I think we got it.
We're good.
We're pirates on jumping.
It'll be.
PDF. We got it. I should be able to figure it out. It's on the PDF now, and we also have.
And then when everyone's in the oh, thank you. I think it was I'm married in nurse. So I think look at that and then I'm going out. We need a channel. Yeah, just like the behavioral.
Yeah. That's sometimes happening.
Yeah.
There is some finality that I don't get. Hopefully not. And it's, yeah,
Yeah, last night.
that is.
Also. Oh my God. Are you seeing that? And then.
I mean, we're just saying the. It was finalizing the verbal presentation. The stuff that's good more with that, but and it's I'm free every time. So I can leave to
Oh, I ended up just walking. Like, yeah,
They're all in Yes. You're wondering how you're. So when it's time for you, we just put say from the beginning. Yeah, so hers is underlined. So if you do like from the beginning, yours will come up there with presenter notes, and then you can still click using.
Oh, nice.
So and then you just get out of that escape, and ours, the PowerPoint or the PDF is apparently always underneath it. Whether she can see her own slides, that's you would have to, I guess, pull those off here. Well, I actually don't even know if we can open two of this in here. I think she could do it. Yeah, I feel like she'll sing here, something like she does. That'll mean everything's turned in, or I missed a deadline and it's behind me now. Yeah. Yeah.
So how?
You can minimize, but I don't think you're gonna be able to see, because it's like when you get ready to go. You can also use this if you want to scan. And then.
Okay, everybody, I think we should probably get started. I want to compliment all of you on going to another session because it's day 3 and clearly my stamina for meetings isn't once what it once was. So just appreciate you coming into another fluorescent room. Thank you. We want to make this like fun and interesting for you. So at any point you should feel free to interrupt or stand up and tell a joke. That's also fine. But the point is not to talk at you, but to tell you about some of the things that we've been doing to see if they might be helpful for you. So in that spirit, I think it's in that spirit. I'm going. Yes, thank you. In that spirit, I want to talk to you about the water and security experiences scales, and we're going to talk you through a few different levels at which they can be useful. So I'm going to kick it off with just an overview, a little bit of the backstory on them. And then we'll have Josh Miller talk about a little bit more on the implementation and how they've been useful for Oxfam to evaluate a program that they had in Sierra Leone. Paula Tallman will join us to talk about some of her work in Indonesia and how water insecurity and women's health. Then we'll move to Cassie Workman, who will talk about some of her work with the WISE scales in Tanzania. We'll go global with Hillary Bethencourt, who will talk about some of the work we've been doing to measure, to get nationally representative samples across 31 countries, and then how we put our data together with FAO, and it told us very interesting things. And last but not least, we'll move to the institutional level, where John Brogan we'll be talking about some of our upcoming work, thinking about measuring experiences with water and sanitation in institutions. Okay, so the backstory. In 2013, I was a baby assistant professor and I got $1 million from the National Institute of Health, which was great. I was like, oh, maybe I'll manage to get tenure somehow or other. And I am trained as a nutritionist. And so the grant was about quantifying the impacts of food insecurity in the first 1,000 days. And with my nutrition hat on, I knew how to measure food insecurity. It's 7 or 8 questions and it works. We know how to analyze the data. Nailed it. With my anthropology hat on, I wanted to make sure I was asking these moms the right questions. Like, is food really what they care about? And so the way we did that is we took cameras and we gave them to mamas and we said, Mama, take a picture of the things that shape how you feed your baby. And we got pictures of food stuff, failed crops and sick chickens. Then we got pictures like this too, pictures about water. And there are thousands of fascinating photos I want to show you. I will spare you those and just describe this one photo. So this is a woman who has a belly out to here. You just can't quite see it because she's face on. And she's going to fetch water. And what you see behind her might make you think, why is she fetching water? There's a big sim tank. But her mother-in-law is not letting her use the sim tank at the house, such that she ended up really hurting herself. And she says going into early labor from going to fetch water. So what that was telling me is that there were a lot of experiences that women were having with water that were shaping their health and the health of their children. And I wanted to quantify those experiences. And my mind was on that because in nutritionists, we measure food insecurity. And the way we measure food insecurity is with experiential measures. So in the 1970s, we used to measure food security using food balance sheets. And what that is how many calories are produced in a country, divide that per capita. And that'll tell you if a country is food secure or not. Now, you're all very smart people, and you can see there's some flaws in that thinking. Not all calories are distributed equally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So starting in the 80s, people started looking to experiential measures of food security, which initially made even nutritionists nervous because we like to count micronutrients and we like to count calories. But the data bore out that experiences of food insecurity was highly predictive of really hard health outcomes like viral load, like mental health, school performance, suicidality. I mean, this soft kind of invisible thing of food security was predicting things that we care about, such that food insecurity has now become one of the indicators for SDG 2. So I'm this baby assistant professor with a beautiful study design, and I thought, I'll just add food insecurity experiences to this beautiful study design. And I went to the literature to see how are people measuring water and water security. And the term water security is a term used to cover all manner of sins. I mean, water security is operationalized many, many different ways. But what became clear to me is that there are 4 major domains within water security. So people generally are talking about 1 or 2 of these in their definitions. So they're talking about water availability. Is there water somewhere out there in the world? And hydrologists are very good at measuring that, as far as I could tell. Hydrologists say like, well, we could be better, but we have a pretty good sense of physical water availability. Access has a lot of different aspects to it because there's physical access. So either can you walk there, or is water being piped to you? Can you afford the water that is there? Are you allowed to go fetch the water? And so on and so forth. So there's lots of flavors of access. And we're pretty good at measuring physical access with the JMP drinking water ladder. The other thing that we're good at measuring is safety. And so there's point of use diagnostics, and there's lots of fancy laboratory equipment. But what I was looking for is something that would cover this holistic experience of water, that covered water, both that we put into our bodies for cooking and drinking, but also all the other things that these moms were really suffering from with water. And there is I didn't know this at the time, but there's kind of a well appreciated need for better data on water. You can't manage what you can't measure is particularly true for water, and major gaps exist. So that led me to develop a scale for to measure water insecurity in Kenya. But I'm trained as an anthropologist as well, and anthropologists love to do comparative studies and see how things vary across different settings. And water insecurity is not unique to Kenya. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to measure water insecurity experiences comparably anywhere there was potentially water insecurity. And that's how the household water insecurity experiences scale was born. Now this was 2018, and this is the product of many, many people's hard work, including 2 people in the audience. So Cassie and Josh were on the team way back then. And this was way more work than I thought. It's kind of like having a baby, like you're not sure if you want to do it after you've done it, but then you've already done it, so you got to scale. And this yielded many things, including a really wonderful research community that does many more things than measure water insecurity. And it's a broad multidisciplinary community that we were lucky enough to get some funding from NSF. So basically we had these 32 candidate items. We thought maybe these would capture universal experiences of water insecurity across those 4 domains. And so we went and tested them, and we collected a lot of data. It was a lot of data for me at the time. This was a lot of sites, and we picked these sites to achieve maximal heterogeneity. So it's not that San Borja is representative of all of Bolivia. San Borja is San Borja, but you can see based on these locations, there are places with lots of infrastructure, like Kathmandu, Singida, like no infrastructure, there's dry, wet, intermittent. So really stress testing these questions, that's the point. And we went from 32 items through lots of talking, these meetings from people who understood much about the sites, these hanger-oners just wanting to be with mom, to like blood, sweat, and tears and statistics. And I'm going to spare you all of that, but this is all on our website, to get to 12 items. And these 12 items are phrased for the original version of the scale. They're phrased, how often in the last 4 weeks have you or anyone in your household, because the unit here is the household. And then these are the 12 experiences, and Josh is going to be so nice as to talk us through each of the items. But what I want you to know now is that you can say if you often or always were angry about your water situation, you score a 3. If you never had to change the food you eat because of problems with water, you score a 0. 12 items, 12 times 3. So the score rate, the range for HYs is 36 points. Takes 3 minutes to administer. Before the ink was even dry on this paper, but at that point I was like, never again another scale. An economist was like, yeah, 12 questions, but can you do shorter? And if some of you know Ed Frangillo said, well, it's either he does it or we do it, Sarah. And so we ended up also coming up with a short version that you will hear more about from Josh. And so this site-specific data has yielded a lot of different kinds of insights, and they're all open access publications, hys.org, you can get to the pubs. We've learned how water shapes infant feeding, injury from water acquisition, COVID stuff. And then we got into some like theoretical insights from anthropology, how water insecurity shapes loaning and borrowing and what that looks like. And then we even have forayed into some economic theory. So I don't know if any of you know what a Kuznets curve is, but what we have found is that there's something like a development Kuznets curve for water insecurity, where as development increases, water insecurity first is low, goes up, and then goes back down. So the site-specific stuff has been great. But we also want sort of like top-down approach. So we already tried the bottom-up. Also want to top down, so we would have something that's very like data that were really robust and comparable. And to do that, we partnered with UNESCO and Gallup to collect data in 31 countries. And these 31 countries represent half the world's population. I mean, if you get China, India, and Brazil, you get there pretty quickly. And but these are, so we have now nationally representative data on these 31 countries. And this is with the IWI scale. So this is at the level of the individual. So that's one difference from the HY scale. The other is that the recall period for this is 1 year instead of 1 month. And there are good reasons for that. Namely, we wanted these data to be comparable. Our purpose for collecting these data was to compare prevalences across country. So in order to account for the variation in temperature, rainfall, we needed to do a 1 year recall period. And you'll hear more about that from Hillary. So the evidence here is really multi-sectoral. I mean, people can care about water insecurity for water security's sake, and that's great. And I care about it for just because it's good to be water secure, but I also care about it because we're seeing it touch on these 4 pathways that you will hear about in various ways, shapes, and forms in the next little bit. So I'm going to pass this now to Josh, who's going to talk, insert slides, is going to talk about inserting slides. Go ahead, Josh. And then if you have questions, feel free to just shout them out, but we have built in time for doing like a practice survey at the end and some other feedback stuff. So we're here.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, this is always exciting to come and be surrounded by my new favorite community of folks, water folks. I also, like Sarah, trained as nutritionist and have been with her for a decade now and got to come along in this journey of hers and now ours and a whole host of other people of coming into the water world. And so I'm going to just dive into a little bit of why it's important to measure human experiences with water and how we actually do that, what the tools look like. So to kick this off, like Sarah said, we now have 2 flavors of the full WISE scale. So these include 12 items. They're both asked in similar ways, just the household version is asked about you and everyone in your household, and then the individual one is just asked about your own individual experiences. And that's really helpful because that allows us to disaggregate the data, and Hillary will get into this later, but we can start to see gender disparities and regional disparities by asking at the individual level. What's really appealing is that these 12 items only take 3 minutes to implement, and they cover a whole range of severity. So everything from worrying about water to going a whole day and night without having any water to drink within your household. The items take the form of how frequently in the past, and as Sarah said, we have tested this with a few different recall periods. One of them is 4 weeks. This is pretty typical within the food realm and is helpful because it gets at some of the past experiences. It's not just the prior 24 hours, but sometimes these things don't happen every single day. So you have to ask about a longer period. And the 12-month recall is also helpful depending on your research purposes if you want to get at maybe seasonality and you don't have the ability to sample at multiple time points. So how frequently in the past 4 weeks have you or someone in your household, I'll walk you through all 12 of these. Bear with me, you'll also see them in a little bit, but worried you wouldn't have enough water for all of your household uses. Had to change your plans or schedules because of water problems. Didn't have enough water to wash your hands after dirty activities. Limited how much water you drank because of problems with water. Changed what you ate or prepared in your household because of problems with water. Experience interruptions to your main water supply. So that includes things like low pressure or the supply is actually just fully cut off, or and this can be planned or unplanned. So some people know that their water is only going to be delivered for 2 hours out of the day. And other times you expect it to come during those 2 hours and it just never arrives. We're unable to wash your clothes due to problems with water, unable to wash your body. Another psychosocial one similar to worry is how did you feel angry or upset about your water situation? Went to bed to sleep thirsty. And this is also analogous to ones we have in food where you go to bed hungry. Just had no water whatsoever in your household. And another experiential interpersonal one is felt ashamed about your water situation. And just to say again, this came from a broader suite of 32 items, and these are the ones that held together across all these contexts. And response options are never, so that's 0 times, rarely 1 to 2 times, sometimes is 5 to 10 times, and often or always is 11 or more times for the 1 month recall period. Hillary knows a little bit more about the 1 year recall. That's not as familiar to me. So just to walk you through an example of what this would look like for one participant in Kenya, if thinking about her household, she might have said, okay, I'm always worried that I'm not going to have enough water for all my household uses. Sometime or rarely do I have to change what's cooked. So most of the time I have enough water, but sometimes it's cut off and I can't prepare the porridge that I'd like to. I'm also most of the time, sometimes angry about my water situation, so on and so forth. You add these up and you get 1 score. So for this individual, that would be 14. And what that tells us is we can compare that across everybody else and their scores, and we can start to see the range and differences and the disparities, but also we can flip it into a binary indicator. So scores 12 or higher indicate water insecurity. So we would designate this household, this individual, as water insecure. Something's going on a little wonky with this converting to PDFs, that's how it goes. There's also the 4-item version. That's the shortened one. This is the one that we were pressed and asked to make it even shorter. So we were trying to capture items that had a diversity of the severity and also held together and captured most of the variation in the full 12-item scale. So what's really nice about this is we see a high correlation between the 4-item version and the 12-item version. So you're doing a pretty good job of representing water insecurity. To note, though, that comes with the caveat of sometimes you're pressed for time, and so you're going to opt for this one, but it's better for measuring prevalence than it is actually getting at the full suite of severity of water insecurity. And so going back to this individual, these are the same responses. And with those, if we just subset it to that, this individual, based on the 4-item version, would still be considered water insecure. So there's concordance, they match up pretty nicely. Sarah showed this earlier, but you are QR codes to all of the blood, sweat, tears, and statistics that went into developing these. They're valid, robust. Like I was saying, there are other items that were dropped, but that doesn't mean that they're not insightful. It just means that they weren't universally applicable. So for your own field setting, we have other indicators or items that you might want to tag on, just if you want to understand, for instance, how water issues impact agriculture. We have a paper under development right now showing how these items also help get at a little bit of the experience of food insecurity, especially among smallholder agriculturalists. We also had some related to perceptions about water quality. These were also really meaningful. They were starting to kind of form their own construct and all these other issues. So they didn't make it in there, but they are really interesting. We have a paper out in Kenya where people were asked to rate their own water quality, and it actually measured it, was highly correlated with the actual E. coli in the water. So folks tend to have a good sense of what their water quality is. And also one that I think is really interesting and has bore out and is really salient context is interpersonal violence and frustrations with community members. So people talking about queuing up in long lines and then getting into fights. We have a paper on that as well, looking across all the sites and how that relates to larger climate change and how in certain areas this matches up with objective reports of violence. So at the community level, so the HY scales are really useful for tracking prevalence and trying to understand the causes and consequences of water insecurity, but I'm going to focus briefly on measuring the impact of programs and shocks. So the tools have been used by a whole host of organizations. I'm going to focus on Oxfam because that's one that Sarah and I worked with and actually had our hands on the data. So this has been taken up by a whole suite of people and we have no idea how it's being used at this point. It's out in the wild. But this Oxfam one we did get to work with, and they included the full 12 items and they included it in 2 different projects. We didn't have the pre-post data to actually get at. They did some fancy statistics behind the scenes to look at program effectiveness and impacts on water insecurity and all of that. But what we used the data for was to, this is how it fit into their whole suite of water indicators. So they also had specific dimensions on water equity, institutions, operations. I'll make a plug for HYs and that they said that this was the best performing item and is most predictive of all their outcomes. So It was a good tool. We were looking at water governance, perceptions of water governance and how water is managed in relation to HY's water insecurity. So the idea being that larger government structures impact ultimately what's happening at the household level. And we'll spare you the analytical details, but we found that better governance was related to lower water insecurity and indirectly and directly related to lower odds of cholera, diarrhea, and drinking unsafe water. So really important public health outcomes. And just the way we concluded that was saying that governance is one strategy that we can maybe lean on to try to improve water insecurity and help and advance the SDGs. To recap, the tools take 3 minutes or fewer to implement. They provide really useful insights that you'll hear from other speakers. And it can be used to try to understand how water insecurity is manifesting and impacting the daily lives of folks. And just to say, Sarah and I are always, and I'm sure everybody else on the team is happy to talk about this all the time. The website hys.org is a really good place to go. We have the tools in dozens of languages at this point. It's just constantly growing. So if you implement and translate it into other languages, please send them our way. You'll be featured on the website. But otherwise, that's it for me. And I think I'm turning.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear more of the details of this work. So my name is Paula Sky-Tallman. I'm a professor at Loyola University in Chicago, and I'm going to be speaking to you about my team's research looking at the relationship between water insecurity and gender-based violence in Sumba, Indonesia. And I'll tell you a little bit about the research we're doing and how we are connecting that research to action. So I work with a fabulous group of people that I actually met through the HY's RCN, which is I guess you could explain it, a website and a group of people, and they have a newsletter, and you should join it if you're interested in these topics. And this brought me together with a team. We are anthropologists, public health scientists, and also professors of social work in the United States, the United Kingdom, Peru, and Indonesia. And what brought us together was this question of whether water insecurity is associated with gender-based violence. And we are looking at, I'm an anthropologist, and we do love to make these cross-cultural comparisons. And so we were looking at this question in Indonesia and Peru. And actually Oxfam was one of the organizations that had put this potential relationship on our radar, as they had observed that in areas where there was not enough water scarcity, which is related, but somewhat different to insecurity, violence against women appear to be more prevalent. And so this project was designed in close collaboration with Oxfam, Water Harvest, and then 2 different NGOs in the respective countries, Prisma in Peru, and then Sopan in Indonesia. Today, I'm just going to focus where we just a few months ago finished data collection. And so we are still doing analysis, and I'm just going to be focusing on the data that has come out of Sumba, Indonesia. So for all of you who might not be familiar where Sumba is, it is in the southernmost province of the Indonesian archipelago. It is the 3rd poorest province of East Nusa Tenggara, which is the southernmost area. And it is one of the driest areas of Indonesia. And so when you think of Indonesia, you may think of waterfalls and tourism, and there's plenty of that, but there's also a great degree of drought. And East Sumba, where we are working, has the lowest rainfall of the region, and yet it has a critically high water consumption index. And what that means is how much water is available, and then how much are people using. So when this number is getting higher, it means there's a problem. People are using more than what's actually there, and it becomes unsustainable. So there is a tension between the needs of people and what is actually available on this island. And what we see is that tension is particularly problematic for women. And so we launched this project to understand their experiences from both the quantitative and qualitative perspective. And so we designed the project in 2 phases. The first one involved both qualitative and quantitative data collection measures, and we did a cross-sectional survey with 365 women heads of household in Indonesia in 4 communities. And we specifically picked 2 communities we suspected to have a better water situation, better water infrastructure access, and then 2 communities that had mostly tanker trucks and surface water collection. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. Within the survey, we collected the regular old demographics on education, economic status, et cetera, and then also HYs that now you know so much about from the prior 2 presentations. In the second phase of the project, we did preliminary data analyses, and then we went back to Peru and Indonesia, and we presented our results to community stakeholders, community leaders, water managers, representative from NGOs, and also local women, because we wanted to understand what they thought about the results and how do we move forward from here? What do you do with this data to affect change? And so these participatory workshops were done in October 2021. When we get into the data, what we see within this whole sample of 365 women and households here, what the water insecurity had a prevalence of about 31.5%, but there were big differences in which these prevalences across the communities. And so community A and B, you can see, are the ones that we thought were going to be more water secured. It piped water and wells that were closer to the households. And you can see down here, if you're looking at that cutoff of above 12 to be categorized as water insecure, 3.8% of the households, 6.3%. And then communities C and D were receiving most of their water through tanker trucks or going to springs and rivers. And so you see 57.1%, 60.7%. So big jumps. And this is important because what it's showing is that HWISE is picking up on these observations. It's lending a quantitative component to it. Although there is the caveat that within what we consider to be water secure communities, there are still exceptions. And so people within these households can still experience water insecurity when they have that infrastructure. We also asked participants about their experiences with gender-based violence. And so we first explained what gender-based violence meant, because some people often think it's just physical violence. So we explained that it's physical violence, psychological violence, economic and sexual violence, and gave some examples of what that was. And we asked women if they had experienced any form of gender-based violence in the last year. They could also specify it if it had occurred rarely, sometimes, often, or always. So when we just look at this kind of categorical variable, have you experienced violence in the last year, we had close to 20% of women in the study reporting that they had indeed experienced this, and the most common manifestations were physical and verbal abuse. But once again, when we start looking at the differences between who is reporting gender-based violence and how they align with these different water secure versus insecure communities, we see some big differences once again. So in the water secure communities, those 2 ones, we lumped them together. Prevalence of reporting gender-based violence was 10.8%. And when we looked at the water insecure communities, it goes about 3 times higher now, so 36.5%. Now, water insecurity is not the only thing that makes these communities different, right? So that's just one component. So we looked at a logistic regression. And what we found when we are controlling for relevant covariates, such as where are you on the economic ladder, food security, the respondent's education and age, we find that if you're water insecure, your likelihood of reporting gender-based violence in the last year goes up close to 5 times. It's big. That's a big jump. And we are working through multi-linear. Okay, let me rephrase that. My colleagues who are experts with quantitative data are working through how you model this in a more nuanced way so we can check how things are changing when you put in water insecurity into these models. But it's robust. There is a robust relationship in this context. And so it leads us to this question. All right. And many, when I would tell people first about this project, they go, water insecurity and gender-based violence, like, I don't get it. But Sarah gave us some insights into what can happen, and so did Josh, where conflicts can arise when there's not enough water in the household and when you're in lines to get it. And when we asked women about their experiences, they would, for example, say, when we take water, sometimes 3 to 4 times in a day, we are tired, and if the water is not there, referring to their husbands, they get angry, just like that. So they are spending enormous amounts of time to get water. Sometimes the spigot, there's no more coming out, they go home, and then things like this happen. These are both victims of gender-based violence. And she said, I was late boiling water when he asked me to make coffee for him, or when I was late cooking, he yelled at me and then hit me on my face. I think maybe because he was so tired and hungry after working in our farm. And so what we're seeing is, of course, there are other factors going on, but that water insecurity can serve as the spark that leads to violence within households. And this is integrally playing into gendered norms, because we know worldwide, not in all cases, but there are trends that women are typically responsible for work associated with water in households. And because they're bearing this brunt when they don't meet their household obligations, which all has a lot to do with culture and patriarchy, it can result in violence. But that was just the tip of the iceberg of what we found. In these interviews, women were telling us about much more than just gender-based violence. We were hearing about wash-related stressors. Somebody from a local organization said the women here only take a bath once a week, thus they're very susceptible to disease. Reproductive burdens, just like Sarah was saying, I still had to draw water until it was time to give birth. I fell near the spring and I was taken to the hospital. I gave birth to my child not being full term. We were seeing this in Peru and Indonesia, women consistently coming back to the stress of water insecurity during pregnancy and the postpartum period as being a really, really severe situation. Opportunity costs, because water is still an issue. I don't think I can do other productive activities while I'm birding, getting water and taking care of other domestic chores. There's, as many of us feel often, there's not enough time in the day to be able to do everything, especially if you are spending a good portion of your day just going to get water, waiting for it and bringing it back home. And then let's not even think about filtering it or making it suitable for consumption. And then another huge focus that emerged from these interviews was an effect on a focus on the biosocial effects on children. People saying because there's not enough water, they can't water vegetables, hence the children don't get enough nutrition. And so some real correlations, obviously, between water and food. And so we're pushing for this concept of gender-based water violence. And when we think about the word violence, once again, we often think about physical altercations, but we are defining violence as something that is so severe as to be causing extreme harm. So we're defining gender-based water violence as a spectrum of stressors associated with water insecurity that are so extreme as to significantly threaten human health and well-being, particularly that of women and girls. And we also find that people with non-binary identities are also at greater risk for gender-based violence generally, and likely in relationship to water, although that is an understudied area. So we need to understand the range and the depth of harm, because without a complete framing, we're going to miss the level of societal protection that water interventions may yield. So what are we doing? We're taking this work, we're translating it into the local languages, into Bahasa Indonesia. We're distributing it to policymakers at different levels. And we're also working with our research partners, since we designed this project in collaboration with NGOs, to say, well, where do you want to go with this? And we are excited to report that a water well was drilled in one of the study sites, and we'll be returning in January to Indonesia to follow up on how we can promote education for gender equity in these areas. Thank you very much.
Oh, and will you be measuring it age-wise when you?
Oh, not in January, but we're going to apply for more money. And what we'd like to do is design, figure out this intervention, co-create it, get it going before, after.
Nice. Great. Well, hello, my name is Cassandra Workman. I am from UNC Greensboro, so just up the road. And today I'm going to provide some insights from my use of the HY scales in both Tanzania and Ghana. So here is what I plan to do. I'm just going to introduce the sites, talk about times I've used it in the past, my current research, outline the usages of HYs, and then elaborate on the utility of this scale in relatively water secure sites. So I was a site PI, so I was part of the original team that was rolled out globally in order to help develop the scale. So I implemented at the time, a much longer version in 300 households, although it did include what ended up being the 12 final items. In addition, I conducted qualitative interviews to complement the use of the battery of quantitative assessments. And it's really important to note that this was enumerated in the rainy season, so I'll come back to that. So I had previously conducted dissertation research in Lesotho, which is incredibly water insecure, and the water insecurity there is drought. When I was doing my research, they had had a 10-year drought. Gardens were failing, people had literally no water. Tanzania, where I was doing my research, I also lived for 7 years. It's an urban area, there's water theoretically plentiful, right? You know, it's the city is based at the bottom of the Luguru Mountains, so it's actually had been what's considered a rainforest prior to extreme deforestation. And so I wanted to see what water insecurity experiences look like in an area where water was presumably plentiful, right? So as I mentioned, this was enumerated in the rainy season. If you look at the mean score, Morogoro is relatively water secure if you compare it to all of the other sites that were assessed at the same time. However, not every single experience is equal. So if you look across all of these 12 items, you say, okay, they're water insecure, let's move on. But if you look closely, you can also use the scale to look at specific experiences with it. And so I use the household one. Now remember that. So what we see here is that, yes, there's water, but it's interrupted. So people face a lot of scheduled cuts and unscheduled cuts. And as I mentioned, I lived there for 7 years. So I also knew what it was to experience when you turn on the taps and there's just no water. It's incredibly, it could ruin your day. You know, when you schedule everything that you're supposed to accomplish and then there's no water and you're like, now what, right? So people in Morogoro Urban are actually very worried about their water. The sense of not really knowing when you're going to have it or not is an incredible psycho-emotional burden. Similarly, people expressed anger, and the anger, which we also saw in the qualitative data, which I'll get to in a moment, is that things aren't working the way they should be. They have this infrastructure that was put in, and it's wonderful infrastructure. The government of Tanzania invested hugely in water, particularly in drinking water. So they sourced donor support. So the MCC came into Morogoro Urban, and in a multi-year project, they rehabbed the dam. So the reservoir was in theory able to provide water for the population at the time. And they also rehabbed the water treatment plant. So also, again, in theory, the water is supposed to be safe. Well, as we all know, these projects take a long time. So by the time the infrastructure was rehabilitated, the population had grown. And so all of a sudden now the system is stressed, right? And so you start to see intermittency as a result. Oops, what did I just do? Start pushing buttons, right? So what we see here is residents express anger over water cuts. They talked about tired pipes. They talked about the water scheduling and how they've had to really work their lives around it. They also found that feeling anger is difficult. They said that they don't want to be angry about their water situation. Again, this is an incredible psycho-emotional burden on folks. We also saw that the quantitative and qualitative data really paralleled in this. And here's an example. Sincerely speaking, we have a big water challenge here. First of all, and this is again, back to all of these wonderful slides talking about governance, right? They know who they think is responsible and they'd like help, right? So then this gets into, again, these issues where what can we do for reliability? What can we do for systems over time, right? And so they would really like this infrastructure to better meet the needs of the community. So this all speaks to the fact that there are psycho-emotional and psychosocial impacts associated with water insecurity. And so that means not only is it individually a struggle, but it affects your relationships with others. So for example, as we saw in one of the 12 items is, did you have to change your plans, right? And so people can't do laundry the way they want to, they can't bathe their bodies. There's a lot of impact, individual impacts that also have repercussions for how they relate to people within their community. Intermittency is both frequent and difficult. So again, this speaks to the monitoring and evaluation of these interventions. Can these systems be maintained over time? And when is it that you'll start to see the breakdown and know that the infrastructure needs new investment? So we also saw variation within Marlboro. So I find that the utility of these kinds of scales is, one, you can use them to assess seasonal differences. As I mentioned, I conducted this research in the rainy season. I could also go back in the dry season to see the difference. But you can also then see the heterogeneity within your site, because not every household scores the same. So at the same time, you can assess the overall prevalence of a community. You can also then look at where in the community, and geographers would have a much better ability to do this with some mapping. Are there areas within the community that are more stressed than others? And perhaps they could receive a little bit differential of an investment, right? Yeah, and so let's move on. So I also implemented the HY scale in Ghana. So I'm there as an anthropologist working with a team of engineers. They developed a technology called the excluder. And what this is when fecal sludge is being dislodged from the pit, it's an auger that actually pushes the trash out of the way so that the sludge could be more effectively vacuum sucked. And it was really, I have this one vivid memory of wrapping Christmas presents and talking to one of the engineers about the consistency of fecal sludge. And I was like, I'm an anthropologist, what am I doing? And you know, it does, water matters into the consistency of it and all of the cultural aspects about water use. So how people defecate, do they use water, do they use ash? You know, this all affects the consistency. So I was also there to assess the gender decision-making within the household regarding when pits should be emptied. So we all know that women are predominantly responsible for the cleaning of latrines, but I was interested in decision-makings about pit emptying and the maintenance of the actual pit. And I was also curious about attitudes towards women actually working in the sanitation sector. Would it be okay if a woman showed up with her vacuum truck and got the hose out, right? And it was great. In Ghana, the truck we were on was called the shit master, and I really should have picked that picture. But you know, this is me participant observing this logic. So again, the reason I wanted to see water insecurity was I wanted to understand the baseline of water insecurity in this area and how it might intersect with sanitation insecurity. Are people not emptying their pits the way they should because they're water insecure? It turns out they're actually relatively water secure here. And I really want to do a comparison because I did notice they're also angry, which is really interesting. So I have an ongoing project in Tanzania where I'm looking at the relationship between food and water insecurity. And I use a framework called syndemic theory, which maybe you're familiar with. It's very popular in public health now. And this is where it's actually that you have two stressors or two diseases and they interact to mutually enhance one another. And so, for example, you see that it's not just not enough water to grow your crops. It's, is the fruit you're preparing for your child clean? Do you have water to wash food? Do you have water to cook food? Is the water going to lead to a lack of dietary diversity? And so there's all these biological outcomes because food insecurity is, again, a very complicated issue, as is water insecurity. There's lots of facets. They're what's known as multidimensional, right, experiences. So again, the applications I feel for the use of this is you can identify relative insecurity or relative security, but at the same time, you can look at the specific experiences within the site. So yeah, the sum score tells you one bit of information, but you can also look at the individual items to see where you might need to focus ongoing attention. You can assess multiple or syndemic insecurities. A lot of our studies have, and we're going to hear a lot more about the relationship between food and water from Hillary, but you can mathematically link these together. So I also think that, you know, assessing the experiences of water insecurity at the household, you can have more targeted or integrated interventions. So in what ways can we approach this more holistically? Because if you're only doing one, maybe the problem can't be fixed, right? And so I also have a previous life of a monitoring and evaluation analyst. So if anyone wants to hear more about how I think this would be useful, this is how you find me.
Okay, I was gonna say, let me. Yeah, just that. Did we get that?
Excellent. Well, these have been wonderful presentations. You've received both a great introduction to what these scales are, as well as some excellent stories from the field of how the household water insecurity experiences scale has been used. Now I want to share some insight that we have learned from using the individual version of this scale, both from the perspective of being able to disaggregate by individual level characteristics and the benefits of that, but also the benefits of getting nationally representative data on experiences with water insecurity in order to make comparisons across countries and see how different experiences can be across different countries. So you're probably all very well aware of the Joint Monitoring Program, JMP Drinking Water Ladder. They have collected incredible data worldwide, nationally representative, on access to basic drinking water services. They provide us an excellent picture of what the prevalence of lack of access to adequate drinking water infrastructure is around the world. However, as you have just heard from previous presentations, access to basic or safely managed drinking water does not necessarily guarantee that you have stable and sufficient water for your everyday consumption and domestic uses. As Sarah mentioned, in order to fully understand the situation regarding water problems around the world, we need to be able to measure it. As Sarah also said, we've got a pretty good handle on certain aspects, certain ways of operationalizing water security. So we have data, for example, on per capita cubic meters of renewable water resources. We also have the data on water infrastructure, drinking water infrastructure specifically, provided by JMP, and their measures of access to safely manage drinking water, as well as the individual tests that we can do on drinking water. We're missing this whole big piece related to measures of accessibility, acceptability, use, and stability across time. Also, we're lacking data up until now from nationally representative samples. We've got great data from different study sites, but in order to really get a clear picture of this, we want to know on a nationally representative level. So with that goal in mind, Northwestern University, UNESCO, and Gallup World Poll partnered in order to collect nationally representative data on the individual water insecurity experiences of 31 low and middle income countries. This was using the individual version of the WISE scale that you have all just heard about. Now, the value of doing this with Gallup World Poll data is that the rest of their survey questions are also done on the individual level, including their survey on food insecurity experience measures. Just a reminder here that those 12 items for the individual level scale are asking about the previous 12 months that anyone had these experiences, with the responses being never, 1 to 2 months in the previous year, in some but not all months in the previous year, and in almost every other month. Otherwise, the responses are scored the same, summed the same. We still have the same cutoff of 12 or greater as representative of water insecurity. So our first goal, after, of course, validating the scale and making sure that it could provide us with cross-country equivalent measures of water insecurity, was to then try to get a picture of water insecurity prevalence in these 31 low and middle income countries. We found that the prevalence of water insecurity ranged quite a lot across countries, as low as 3.6% in China, but as high as 63.8% in Cameroon. When we pooled data across countries from just the sub-Saharan Africa region, got a prevalence of about 36.1%, which interestingly matches pretty well with JMP's measure of the percent of households lacking access to basic drinking water services. However, the picture doesn't always agree with other indicators. For example, here I plotted the prevalence of water insecurity in these 31 countries against Aquastat data on total renewable water resources per capita. We found no relationship between water insecurity and regional water supplies, suggesting that just having the availability of water around you doesn't guarantee water security. Now, when we plotted this data against the JMP basic drinking water service measure, we did see a moderate correlation, as we would hope. Not that we want to see these relationships, but that we're seeing that these indicators are measuring something similar, and yet there's still discrepancies. So while as a whole, countries that have less coverage of access to basic drinking water services tend to also have more adults experiencing water insecurity, we have some countries down here that JMP data suggests have nearly universal access to drinking water services, but that still have pretty high water insecurity. For example, Egypt, supposedly less than 1% of households lacked access to basic drinking water services, yet 27.2% of the adults in our sample experienced water insecurity. Likewise, 5.6% of Algerian households lacked access to basic drinking water services, yet 28.9% of Algerian adults experienced water insecurity. So we were able to get a measure of prevalence of water insecurity across countries. And of course, now in addition to comparing these data across countries, we're interested in trying to understand then, what are some of the characteristics of those who are more likely to be experiencing water problems around the world? And is it the same demographic across countries, or does it differ? We were surprised to find that the characteristics of water insecure individuals vary widely across countries. Now, we've heard a lot about the burden that women experience in terms of their responsibility as water collectors in the households. We imagined that women then would tend to say that they were experiencing all of these problems more frequently than men. And yet we didn't actually find a substantial difference by gender. In fact, when we looked across countries, we found that there were 6 countries, Cameroon, Senegal, Mauritius, Algeria, India, and Guatemala, where we saw that relationship that we were expecting in terms of IWISE scores being on average higher among women than among men. But there's a whole lot of countries here where there is no relationship. And there were even a couple of countries where men on average had a higher IWISE scores than women. So this provided us a new picture that we've never able to glean from previous data that was not able to disaggregate at the individual level. Likewise, the JMP data tends to suggest that rural households are more likely to lack access to basic drinking water services than urban households. When we looked at urbanicity and IWISE data, we found that indeed in some places like Ghana, South Africa, Namibia, Morocco, it was rural residents that tended to experience higher water insecurity. Yet in some places, rural residents had lower IWISE scores than those living in urban areas. And in a lot of our pooled samples, when we were pulling data across either regions or the entire sample, we actually found that individuals that reported living in city suburbs or outskirts tended to have the highest IY scores compared to those living in the city proper or rural residents. And similar variation was observed in other sociodemographic characteristics. All of these models controlled for things like income, household size, age, and we found the same degree of variation across a lot of countries where basically we couldn't assume in any given country that we knew who the most water insecure individuals were. Now, we've heard a little bit also about the effect that water can have on what foods can be prepared and cooked in the household. We've been measuring food insecurity on a global level for years. This is the first time that we've been able to link that data with water insecurity in order to see if there is a relationship and how strong that relationship is. So food insecurity, the food insecurity experience scale was administered in 25 of the 31 countries in which we had IWIS data. What we found is that in general, over half of the individuals in each country that experienced water insecurity also experienced food insecurity. Overall, we're seeing that water insecurity and food insecurity experienced concurrently is a major issue in many of these countries. Of course, we all know that there are shared causes of both food insecurity and water insecurity, like socioeconomic factors. You can afford water, you might be more likely to afford food. Controlling for socioeconomic factors and other covariates, we still found that across regions, individuals that experienced water insecurity had a 2- to 3-fold higher odds of also experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. That's huge. So what can we conclude from these data? What insight do these provide? Well, first of all, we realized that IWIS is able to add to the picture and give us a more comprehensive understanding of the water problems faced in different areas of the world. It also has taught us that we can't assume that we know who is the most water insecure within and across all regions and countries. This means that we need higher resolution data on water insecurity around the world in these and other countries on a regular basis in order to be able to understand who is experiencing the biggest burden. That is going to be critical, as Patsy mentioned, for identifying which populations are most in need and thereby targeting policies and interventions to help those that are experiencing the greatest problems with water. This also means understanding that with concurrent insecurities being experienced, we should also probably be thinking about these insecurities together as we're developing policies and interventions. If you address one issue without the other, this could be leading to incomplete interventions and policies. So I just want to acknowledge that this is a collaboration among Sarah Young, Ed Frangillo, folks at FAO, and many others at the Gallup World Team. Just want to thank you today for hearing this presentation.
I'm right behind you. I can carry you through. No, just kidding.
So this is the last kind of case study. I'm gonna wrap it up with after John goes with like 2 more slides, and then we'll open it to Q&A.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Brogan. I'm a WASH advisor with Habitas, and we're going to talk about expanding the WISE scales for WASH and for institutions. So the Swiss Water and Sanitation Consortium is a partner supported by the Swiss Cooperation We work in schools and in healthcare facilities. We have an approach to do washing schools with environmental education, good land and water management practices. And in healthcare facilities, we use the WashFit tool to improve outcomes in those facilities. If we just look at a snapshot of some of the work that we've done from 2020 to 2021, in 124 schools in various countries, we see that we are moving in the right direction. Our outcomes are focused on improved services on water, sanitation, and hygiene. This has been great. It's largely attributed to access to infrastructure and to some practices, but we have a blind spot. How are people experiencing these services? We really need to adjust the needle. We really need to shift for more investments in WASH, in healthcare facilities and schools. And what kind of data can we create in order to support that process? So if we look at these results in schools, we could also ask the question, what do these improvements or changes in WASH services, what does that mean in the experiences of the students, in the experiences of the teachers? So you have different types of hand hygiene stations. You have tippy taps, which are quite a novelty for a few days, but then the water starts pooling and you know what's happening there. You have teachers that are really tasked on initiating hand hygiene routines. This is several times washing the hands during the day. What if there's not enough water to do that? They might have a basic level water service, but they don't have the water they need to do hand hygiene. Similarly, our frontline health workers. In the image on the right, you have a hand hygiene station in a point of treatment, but this pipe system is broken. So they've set up a container, they've set up a tap that works as a basic JMP standard. But what about the interruption of that service? If the water is not there, they have to fill up the container several times. So this can lead to some frustrations in their administrative care. Let's think about the cleaners. If there is no chlorine, they may be trained on IPC measures. They may have the routines that they need to have for doing the cleaning, but they may be limited to mopping with water. So how frustrating would that be as a trained cleaner in their own experience? So we've seen that water insecurity experiences, as Hillary and Sarah have been talking about, they're common in countries where infrastructure looks adequate. What's going on in the institutions as well, in the schools and in the healthcare facilities? As members of the Swiss Water and Sanitation Consortium, we do what we can to have governance, to have days when the stakeholders, when the rights holders go and they talk to the duty bearers and they say, you know what's happening in this healthcare facility, it needs some change, it needs some improvement. But this is really just a drop in the bucket. We can do this in maybe 100 communities or 200 communities. And our question was, what could we do if we had a tool that we could measure these people's experiences at scale and on a national level? And so we approached Sarah and Josh about this. They were quite open to looking at it. We are really now looking at how can we go beyond HWIS and see what about the other WASH services and how to design this for schools and healthcare facilities. We started a partnership. We are looking at collaborating on new scales based on the same methodology that was used to create the HWIS scales and the IWIS scales. Looking at health clinics and hospitals. So what could be the experiences of frontline healthcare workers, the patients themselves in schools? What about the teachers and the students? What are they saying? Maybe going beyond the 3 WASH indicators in schools, looking at menstrual health and hygiene, also looking at waste services. We're at the beginning of this journey. We've mapped out 4 phases. Right now, we are starting to put together some candidate questions, and Sarah has mentioned an interactive part of the session. This is the first draft of a number. I think there's 20 or 21 questions that we're looking at for Washington schools for students. What is their experience of their different access to services? The next step will be the step of field testing. As was done for the HWIS, over 30 countries participated. We do need to do the same thing for this. The name right now is InWise, institution-wise. Let's see what happens. Then there'll be a phase of scale validation and then dissemination. So we are looking for partners in this. We're looking for experts who can feed into these candidate items, these questions. We're looking for field partners to help us test this. As well as financial partners. I think we have our phases 1 and 2 more or less covered in the budget. We're looking for additional support if you're a donor. So with that, I mean, I really appreciate Sarah and Josh, the work that you've done to lay this. I'm really much surfing on this wave. We talked about this for a while, but let's see what we can do with this. And, yeah.
Oh, yeah, so homework. So what you're seeing here is a list of what I will lovingly call kind of crappy questions. They're a first pass at getting at experiences that students would have with WASH in school. First pass. I mean, we're starting with schools because schools are more straightforward than healthcare facilities. And so we're starting here, but we plan to expand. So if you can be as critical as possible, it's always more helpful than saying like, good job. Okay, so I hope that this has given you a little taste of the different ways that we can use these WISE data. So we can look at them at the level of the country and see, you know, compare across countries. And we can see within countries who's having water insecurity problems. But we can also use it to evaluate programs. And we didn't really get into the data, but Oxfam found it extremely useful to be able to have a before and after measure to say how well it was like 80% of the population was water insecure beforehand, and then there was 23% after. But then, you know, I'm driven by maternal and child health, and when we can start to measure water insecurity and understand how that predicts food insecurity, domestic violence, I mean, HIV viral load, even we have data on that. It's quite compelling. And for these reasons, it can be used to make decisions about investment. It has been used to advocate for resources, for example, in the Six Nations communities in Canada to pay for water bills when they saw just how high water insecurity was. They've been implemented a lot of places. This is good. I'm greedy for water data. Is this like my fun to get data? It's also fun when people are doing things and you know they don't have to tell us anymore. The scales are open access. They're out in the world. Anyone can use them however they want. I beg of you to not drop just like one question. You can add as many as you want, but in order for your findings to be comparable across sites, I beg of you, don't drop a question. I'm delighted that USAID has mandated the HWISE 4 in Feed the Future midline zone of influence surveys. I think that's what they call it, zone of influence survey. So suddenly it will be a wash in data. The government of Mexico included the HWISE scale, the full scale, in their National Health and Nutrition Study, which is absolutely delightful because it was when a government takes it up themselves, and it's not me like pushing or like asking or paying. They did this and the data Hillary is starting to look at now, I mean, they're fascinating. And this is really our first glimpse at some harder health outcomes in large populations. UNICEF piloted it in Mongolia in one of the Mix Plus surveys, and I think there are plans for others. So all this is to say, it's useful for different purposes. So to summarize, it's holistic. I see great things in the WASH sector, but I feel like the human voice is sometimes missing, and this brings that. And it's also more precise. So when you're measuring at the level of the individual, that's more precise information with which to predict outcomes or understand impacts of programs and how there are disparities. I mean, Mark Twain maybe or maybe didn't say that water is whiskey's for drinking and water is for fighting. But in households, it's not distributed equally. Whiskey's not distributed equally in households either, but it's more precise. It's also more proximal. And what I really appreciate about the WISE scale is that as far as we have seen, and we have done analyses every which way till Sunday, that the data are comparable across settings and they're comparable across time and climates and cultures. I don't think I didn't point out that right now Gallup is collecting data in additional countries, including in high income countries, Australia and the US. We'll have those data in hand soon. We'll see if they hold up in high income countries. I mean, so far so good, but there will probably be tweaks. It's 3 minutes. I mean, that I know that economists think that 3 minutes is a lot, but we do have the 1 minute version as well, and it's simple to analyze. And it's familiar to a lot of people in certain development communities. I think of it as a sister scale to the food insecurity experiences scale. And Carlo Cafiero, he said it. He said, "Yeah, it's the sister scale." So if Carlo says it, you know it's true. British foreign minister Zach Goldsmith talked about this at the last Stockholm World Water Week as a smarter indicator to hold stakeholders accountable. Now, it can be scary to be held accountable. I mean, it's much easier to say like, hey, we're going to build a borehole. We build a borehole. Look, there's one borehole. And it's to see how people's experiences vary. But this can hold people accountable. And it's for this reason that there's now discussion about this becoming a post-2030 SDG target. So what are the next steps in the WISE adventures? More scales. So you heard about that from John. I swore after the first one I wouldn't do another one. And you'll see me with more gray hair next time you see me, because these scales are hard, but it's worthwhile. And I just want to also make a plug. Prisons. So I'm actually teaching in a prison right now in Illinois, and I had no idea, none, about the ways that water is weaponized there. So just for no one else but myself, I'm really committed to making a scale to measure water insecurity in prisons. Forthcoming data. So like I mentioned, we have data from the government of Mexico and other high income countries. I was so happy that Senator Duckworth wrote a letter to the CDC requesting that they put HYs in NHANES. I mean, I think a letter and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. I'm not sure what that's actually going to mean, but there's a lot of interest by both of our Illinois senators in water stuff. And I'm hopeful that we eventually get data in the US. We're also working on getting regional buy-in. So in April, we'll have a meeting in where there's really a growing number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. They've all implemented this in various, like Sarah Young was not involved in the data collection. They did it themselves. And there are a number of other countries who are interested. So we'll be having a sort of like a consensus building meeting in April. Asia Development Bank, we're working with them to see how this indicator fits in their the ADO report. And then more nationally representative data are coming. So my evil plans are, we now have data on all of these countries in 2022, but I want to paint this map green. I want to know, I think we need to know what people's water lives look like. And I don't want these data to sit on them and write boring papers that 12 people read, maybe even 14 people have read them now. What I want these data for is for all of us, is to make this the basis for robust policy and as a global public good. I mean, we have this for food insecurity. And Gallup measures food insecurity in every country, pretty much every year. And that brother scale needs the sister scale to keep him company. So that is our presentation. Thank you for sitting through another talk. I want to really appreciate all the panelists. Thanks for the great, if you can please come up here and we'll take all the really hard questions. Yes, please. In the man in the uniform.
Matt Logier from CDC. I do have a question. I was two questions. One is, how did you come up with 12 as the cutoff?
Yeah.
And then the other question is, has it been used in like a pre-post water infrastructure studies where they've implemented horrible systems and you see changes in the
Yeah. So Oxfam used it in Sierra Leone. There were 900 villages. It wasn't exactly pre-post, but it was got the intervention and didn't get the intervention. And I have a slide that I can show you those data where you see like the proportion goes down, the proportion of people who are water insecure goes way down.
Yeah.
And you can even see by which items. 12 items. So shorter is, I don't know if this is appropriate to say or not. I'm going to say it. So scales are like a lady's skirt. They should be long enough to do the job, but short enough to keep it interesting. Kathy Rasmussen told me that. And so less is more, basically, but you don't want too short of a skirt.
Not 12 items, the score of 12.
Oh, the 12 is a cutoff. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I can, but it's technical and if you see me after, I'll show you the exact paper. But Josh and Hillary were intimately involved in those decisions. And so far that has also held up. There's discussion about making it like a mild cutoff as well, because 12 is, it takes a lot to get a score of 12.
Okay.
Hi, and what?
Two questions.
Yes.
Congratulations. The first one is, have you had an experience of using the MY scale, the HY scale in community settings where the community members interview one another? I feel like it's simple enough where it could be an intervention on itself, so that the data collection is for the community, by the community, with the community.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. So, I know you're okay. Sorry.
Sorry. Before we go.
Yeah.
It's for Hillary, so the basic service level, super different, no, than the safety management level. Usually we're comparing basic level with the water insecurity, should be compared to the safely managed service level.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. The reason we didn't is because they're still collecting data in a lot of places. So there's a lot of gaps in that particular indicator for a lot of countries still. So we are hoping that we will get more data. To your question, I think there were maybe 16 countries of the 31 that we had. So it's kind of hard to do a correlation, but it's closer than the basic water services. It's a great question.
And maybe we can hit up the JMP crew for some more data while they're in the room. The community question, did any of you want to take that? No, okay. So, yes, and in fact, there's a large, I can't remember what the acronym is. It's basically, it's a very large India, SPARC is the acronym, SPARC. And it's like, what do women want? Like the voices of women, what do women want? And they was on a panel, and this woman, Sheila Patel, is amazing. She is so energetic and she's so sick of like empty platitudes. And she is like, we are doing this, we're doing this, and we don't need you people to do this, meaning me. Like, we're gonna do this and we're gonna present these data to our own group. So if you would like to know Sheila's experiences with that, I can put you in touch with her. At the back in polka dots. Or
it's really exciting to see the scale of the index. So, but just like a technical question about the verification behind it, some of the items are very straightforward and they should work everywhere, but some that are maybe like more heavily perception based or like psychosocial in nature. How I also work on an ownership scale, and we tend to go through, so this is feelings of ownership, it's not like real ownership, and we replicate that verification in different country settings, because actually we do see a difference in how people perceive concepts. And did you encounter similar problems?
So in the validation of both the HYs and the IYs, in terms of verifying whether or not they're cross-culturally equivalent, the scales as a whole are cross-culturally equivalent. But it's true that there are certain items that seem to be functioning a little bit different in some places than others. So to the, to Cassie's point about the benefit of looking at different responses to different items, I think within a context that can be really valuable, but I would actually be careful about making comparisons for that very reason of differences in like psychosocial response, those particular questions in particular. But I would be careful about making comparisons across frequencies of specific items. But the scale as a whole, we know that we can make comparisons in like overall IY score and prevalence.
So like, it wouldn't be appropriate to say, well, the proportion of people angry, and angry is probably the most variable one, because some people feel very comfortable to be angry. Tanzanians, in my experience, hate being angry. They're, it's just like, it's not a thing. So all this is to say is like, be careful when you look at, when you compare across single items across settings, but there is information to be got.
Plus the power of the scale is that as a whole, it does paint a picture around the concept that you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is that this is an experiential measure, and people say like, oh, it's just your perceptions. I would say it's your experiences, and what people experience drives much of what they do, if they correctly perceive it or not. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up, I actually don't know. And my question is already asked, so but it is a follow-up question somehow. So you are using the methodology of PSI tools up till now. So they use this item construct method where they calibrate actually.
Yeah.
This problem.
Yeah.
That's the method they use, wash model, right? And I'm sure Carlo Cabiero already mentioned about it 1,000 times before I was working for FAO, by the way. So I'm now curious, so you can use that method then?
Do you want to take that?
So we did look at it using a Roche
You
model,
can't write a paper with Carla without looking at it.
right? That said, I think we've been dealing with this difficult balance between having the best statistical procedures for modeling the trait of water insecurity and making this scale user friendly. And I think the primary goal at this moment in time has been to develop a scale that we can proselytize and get everyone everywhere to be using, even if they don't have a good handle on IRT and Roche models.
The other difference is that these are not clearly, like with food, we know like the most extreme questions and we know the least extreme. And the water doesn't follow that pattern in the same way. So it's hard to order them in.
With the type, I mean, with the amount of data you have, I think you have still valid information to check the distribution. Then actually
Yes.
the threshold, if your question
Yeah,
is also linked to that. I think you
Yeah.
have a really good material to test and look
Yeah,
at. And
we
again, Carlo will be the one. I'm not the person, but I'm sure he will be the one telling this already.
yeah. I mean, at this Latin American Caribbean meeting, we'll be talking again about cutoffs and,
Yeah.
and appropriate thresholds.
And if you're moving toward comparable in general, I think that's.
Yeah,
it.
I think that there's a lot that can be done on the analysis side, but in terms of like what we're trying to get people to use, I think that there's what we've been able to see looking at doing various tests of cross-cultural equivalence is that we're able to do a lot with the raw score, even though I totally acknowledge all of the limitations that Carla would point out with that. So future research, I definitely agree. There's a lot that can be done. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm Linda Donald from Easy Water for Everyone. I'm wondering if you've done anything in a pre-post manner. For example, we have in the most rural of settings a device that does filtration to produce pure water. So have you looked at a village or villages that have nothing, they're really scouring for things? We do an intervention such as that, and then
I would highly encourage you to use the HY scale in that setting.
about
Okay,
it.
great.
We have a booth here, so
Okay, I'll come by.
any minute anyone has, Nathan and I would very much like to speak with you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Because we're already doing pre and post surveys.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Adam?
Hi, I'm Julie from PAC. Thank you. This is really, really exciting. Thinking about a systems perspective and systems approach, I think this is one of the key components that's been so sorely missed and giving that voice to the users. So awesome. My question is around the perspectives. And so from the individual wise, the I wise, and then thinking about institutions, have you looked at, for example, in the water sector, the water security from the clients, the consumer's perspective versus the water service provider's perspective versus the district health officer, similar for schools and institutions? I'm curious if there'd be, what differences there'd be there. And then the second question is from an advocacy perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how either governments or the data users are using this data for action?
Two hard questions. No, we have not looked at the service providers like perspectives on this. I think that would be interesting. I told you I hate making scales though, and I keep making them. So you want to make that one? I salute you. I'm sorry, I forgot the second question.
The kind of data for action.
Oh, right. So a great example was, so we piloted the HY's survey in 6 Nations communities. And it was right before COVID happened. And so as COVID everyone was sort of getting into lockdown and people's water was being shut off because of non-payment. And with these data, I had nothing to do with this, but with these data in hand, they went to the municipal government and said, like, I don't even know what the numbers are, but like 72%, whatever, are water insecure. Like, we need to pay for their water bill. And that felt so good. Like in a paper schmaper, like, look, it's actually helping someone. So I'm looking for more examples, but I suspect that they'll be emerging.
Thanks.
In the purple shirt.
Eric Quinn, Rotary International, so we're right in the backyard.
Their headquarters are in Evanston.
So, my question is kind of, building off that last question around advocacy is, have you utilized this tool with civil society directly? Those that are in a key, decision-making bodies at the local level.
Yeah.
How successful has that been?
Yeah.
What amount of capacity building is needed?
Yeah. So in terms of civil society, so in Brazil, there's a law that food insecurity must be measured every year. And we were so lucky that the people who are the civil society organization who's mandated to do that added the water security questions. And they are really talking a lot about food and water insecurity in Brazil right now. So yes, civil society is doing this. Long day. What's your second question? It was good.
And
too.
just to add on, we're
Yeah.
also in process doing that in both Peru and Indonesia. And I think there's a difference. You can look at different places and say one is getting water and one is not. But when you have this harder quantitative data, you say, well, we really need interventions in these particular communities. And so that's really going through these local governments and making sure everything's accessible to them and then following up. So we're in process for that.
I'm thinking particularly Rotarians are really in this unique position right now where they're bridging that the end user with the service provider and helping with that dialogue to happen.
Yeah.
They've been kind of creating their own little indicators for within the community, and this would be more.
Yeah. We've got a scale for you. In the red, please.
Yes, so thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's really useful, like perspective and measure use. And I also concerned about policy and loss governance, like the root cause, like for all of your explanation. Hopefully there will be government uptake and all of the questions already asked about that. One particular thing, I'm from Indonesia and I was born in the island. You take the research in and I know exactly what happened. And I think like combination between qualitative data is like more beneficial if we can understand why, like the global data is so good, but sometimes we have to know why it happened in specific context, because I've been Africa for so many years. We try to advocate for Ministry of Health to include gender transformative approach if they're not successful yet in Indonesia. We also already support the civil society report on data report and including WAS also. But it's really good we have now the gender-based perspective to it. But still, like the challenge sometimes, even when you have best data you could have, it doesn't guarantee action. And for the healthcare facilities, we've done the WAS fit also, but it doesn't guarantee there will put money in healthcare facilities from the district or even the national. We could use that, but I would like to know more about the government uptake. You say they adopt the data, they adopt the scale to use, which is really awesome. And then after that, how can they use the data to make decisions? And then is it really make them prioritize border security? And that's what
Well, I will keep you posted. We are 5 minutes past. There is so much to say. I want you to, I just wondered if there are any wrap-up questions, any comments from anyone on the panel? And otherwise we'll be hanging here and we'll answer all your other questions, but release you to coffee and treats. Thank you. Great job. Oh, thank you.
This one, my wife.
Oh.
This device.
Oh, can I use it plus?
Very unusual, very unique. Using hemodialysis, which have a 45 virus suspended through.
Awesome. Thank you. I will. Thank you.
You're interested in these, right, Philip? And what you do, you could apply what you do, what we need. Huge differences in the whole performance of people who have not had diarrhea in the midst of their lives. Virtually nothing.
Presentation was very exciting. We start now. I want to give you a pen. You mentioned about because I wonder if some of them are maybe in